Okie dokie. Welcome, everybody. We're going to get things kicked off. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the Student Design Hub Speaker Series, Design and Review. And the goal of this speaker series is to explore how different industries and roles and disciplines tackle design problems. So before we kick things off, a quick couple of housekeeping items. You might see on the right-hand side, there's a bunch of participants there. If you don't see those participants, don't worry, you're not alone. You have company. Sometimes the WebEx interface can be a little bit silly, so we do see you. So don't be afraid to fire your questions in the chat at any time. I'm going to do my best to moderate those for Clark throughout the session, and we're just going to have time for a Q&A at the end. If you want to come up on the screen, you're welcome to do that. Just type in the chat, I'd like to ask my question, and then that way I can pull you in. You can be a presenter. Again, another WebEx interface thing that we have to navigate. But we can pull you up, and then you can ask your question in person if you'd like to. And if you're having some technical difficulties there in the background, we will do our best to help you out. So again, just type in the chat, and I'll try to help you over the chat bar there remotely while Clark's giving the presentation. So without any more delay, I'm going to hand things off to Clark Oake, a full stack developer at PolyUnity Tech.
Thank you very much for the intro, Kyle. I'm going to struggle through trying to get my screen shared here. So if everybody could just bear with me for a moment, I'll get us set up to get started. Okay. Can everybody see the screen now?
It's looking good on my end.
Perfect. All right. So welcome, everybody. As Kyle said, my name is Clark Oake. I'm a full stack software developer at PolyUnity Tech Incorporated here in St. John's. And today we'll be talking a little bit about the basics of user interface design, some of the stuff that I work on each and every day here at PolyUnity. So without further ado, let's get into it. A little bit of background on myself. So formally, I was actually educated as an electrical engineering technologist, and I spent several years working as a maintenance technician in the oil industry and a few years working as a research and design technologist with the marine industry. During COVID, I got laid off from my job, and I was never really happy in oil and gas. And so I decided to switch things up. And through a local startup called Get Coding, I actually did some full stack web development training. In January of 2021, I got hired with PolyUnity, and I've been there ever since. So I started off, my tech stack is basically JavaScript or TypeScript, React for the front end, Node for the back end, and we use Google Cloud Provider. So at no point in any of my career have I ever had formal training as a user interface or user experience designer. Everything I'm going to show you today have been things that I've kind of picked up along the way and educated myself on. So some of the things we'll talk about today, first of all, what is user interface, user experience, UI, UX? And if you hear me use the terms UI, UX very fluidly, they are very similar things, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Topic 2 is why does it matter? So why should people care about what it is and what impact it has? Topic 3, we'll talk about how to improve user interface and user experience. And then at the end, we'll go over some open discussion, questions and answers. So if anybody has any questions, I'd love to hear from you. So what is user interface and user experience? Well, let's start off with a quote here. So because every person knows what they like, every person thinks they're an expert on user interfaces. And that's actually true to an extent. So everybody has a ton of experience using UI in many shapes and sizes. And if it works for you, then it is arguably a good user interface. One of the key concepts with UI UX, though, is that it needs to work for everybody. So just because we have these conceptions in our head about what it should be doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way that it should be. So user interface, at its core, it displays data. They can be elements that are static or interactive or a combination of the two. And the main goal of a user interface is to provide a critical path to your users. And that critical path should be the outcome that they want to achieve. So it should be very easy for them to go in and see, okay, there's these form fields here and I want to accomplish this task. So I want to order a product or I want to purchase something. So they should be able to very fluidly go through that whole thing and successfully place that order. So here we can see this is MUN's student homepage. And so this is what we would consider to be a menu-driven interface. And so in terms of a user interface, this is a really good example because there's a lot going on here. And so I want to take a second here just to look through and see what kind of elements we've got. So one of the first things with any user interface we want to look for is, where is your eye drawn to? So what's the first thing that you see on this page? For me, that would be the learn to succeed right in the very middle of the page, which could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. Depends on what you want your users to do here. One of the other things we need to think about is, what questions pop into your mind when you see this? And so for me, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is, where should I be looking on this screen? Right? So because there's so many different things that you have to be able to do through this interface, we need to be really cognizant as designers of where we want people's eyes to flow. So the last question I want to ask on this one is, if you were to check your grades, where would you click? Where do you think that you would have to go? And so if I was a student coming to this page looking to see what my grades for the semester were, well, right off the top, I don't see anything. I can see a gradulator in the top right corner, but I don't really think that's what I need. So this is leading me to ask questions and to wonder and to waste time, basically. Users, when they come to a page like this, oftentimes will just scan through the whole thing, look for the most reasonable option, and then just start clicking. It's not often that you get people that'll stop and really think through the whole thing of how to get to where they want to go. So that brings us to the next slide, which is user experience. And so a few of those things that I just talked about would be examples of user experience. So how do users feel about the user interface that they're looking at? Is the interaction satisfying or frustrating? So do they know where they need to go? Do they know what they need to do? Or do they feel confused or maybe a little bit lost? Is the critical path that we're laying out for them easy to follow? And if we understand the needs of our users, so for example, a student looking to find their grades, we can create a user interface that facilitates good user experience. So if we look at that same page again for just a second, if I was a student looking for my grades, well, the first thing I would think about on this page is, oh, that learn to succeed picture is pretty cool. I wonder what that means. It's not really clear to me, so that's probably not what I need. Then I would look up maybe back to the top left of the page, and I can see, okay, there's a home menu, there's a students menu, there's a MUN mail. So it looks like I'm in the students menu right now, so that feels fine. I think I'm probably in the right place. Now I'm gonna have to scan through all of these different menus and see which one makes the most sense for me to try to find my grades. So looking through everything, the only reference I see is the gradulator, and I don't really think that's what I need. So I would probably have to go back to the self-service. So I'd have to launch Memorial self-service, and by doing that, now I'm creating a whole new slew of questions for myself. So because we're into this big menu with so many different options, it can oftentimes be very difficult to streamline these things for users. And not to pick on MUN here, but this is a really good example of a very difficult piece of user interface to design, because you've got so many different users coming here for so many different reasons, and there's only so much real estate. There's only so much cognitive loading that we want to put onto users so that they can be successful with our websites. So this is definitely a very challenging website to be able to effectively design. So on that note, the ease of use may be invisible, but its absence sure isn't. And so this is one of those situations where I'm sure there's been many times when you've been using user interface where if everything goes really smoothly, really seamlessly, you probably don't even notice that it's there. But as soon as you find something that hangs you up or stalls you or makes you think, then it becomes very obvious very quickly that the ease of use is not there. And that's a really good indicator that maybe your UI or UX needs some work. And so moving on to the next here, user experience and usability in general is technology informed by psychology. And so as much as there is intuition, creativity, and flexibility in user interface design, there's also pretty strong science behind it. So this relates to human factors, and that's basically how people interact with systems and how those systems can be better tailored for people to succeed within them. And so user interface, user experience, the design of it really relates back to integrating technology, psychology, and graphic design together into a single discipline. And so just to prove that I'm not completely making this up here, let's take a look at this next slide. So I'll pause here for a second. But graphic design has rules and they work. So I unfortunately can't see anybody's face in the presenter view here, but I'm hoping that you've just realized that this is a bit of a mind. It's kind of a gotcha situation here. So because of the way that the text hierarchy is set up here, because of the way that the colors are used, because of the way that some of these bigger headers and scanning left to right, top to bottom, you can actually see that with some very clever user interface design, you can actually control your users and have them go where you want them to go. So I actually stumbled across this after I built the deck, and I was like, that's too good not to include. So hopefully that worked for everybody. So now that we've established what the user interface and user experience actually is, let's talk about why they matter. Because again, it's something that we work with daily, right? All of us have worked with user interfaces in many different shapes and sizes and forms. Why is it so important that we get them right? So some people think design means how it looks, but of course, if you dig deeper, it's really how it works. And so this really resonates with me because the power of a good design cannot be understated. If a picture itself is worth 1,000 words, then a well thought out user interface, user experience mockup is worth about 1,000,000 words. It answers a lot of questions and it lets people very quickly see where things break or where things don't really make sense. And we use user interfaces constantly. So there's software and programs on our laptops, on our phones. There's apps and websites that we use with our devices each and every day. There's even appliances. So your stove has a user interface on it. And when you go to turn things on, you turn a dial and set the temperature on the stove. So that's actually a human machine interface, which is still a version of a user interface. It still has to be designed. It still has to be engineered. And there's probably lots of other examples. I put the question mark in there for this slide deck because I figured this would be a little bit more of an open forum, but unfortunately WebEx is not cooperating. So if you have any more examples, please write them in the comments or hang on to them until the end and we can have another discussion about this. So bad user experience leads to errors. And this is a pretty extreme example, but the bad user experience that Citibank was using, the bad user interface that they had actually cost them $500 million. And so if we look at the image on the right here, this is the actual software that they were using. And so what happened was they were trying to pay back a portion of a loan, but instead of just paying back a certain portion of the principal, they actually paid back the whole thing well early and cost themselves a ton of money. And so if we actually look at this interface on the side, you don't have to be a subject matter expert in finance to know that this probably isn't the most intuitive UI. I can definitely see how it's very easy to make those mistakes. And so bad user experience leads to errors. Maybe not this extreme, but I can guarantee that if it's not intuitive, people will find a way to use it as you didn't intend them to use it. Bad user experience loses conversions. So this is hopefully not something that too many people have experienced, but I'm sure it's probably quite common. So if you're going to purchase a product online or check out your shopping cart, and then you get validation errors. So okay, there's an error with this, but how do I as a user solve this? I hit okay, and now I go back. I don't know which information is right or wrong because this error message hasn't actually told me anything useful. Where are the validation errors? Is it my credit card? Is it the delivery address? Is it me as a person? Am I valid? Who knows? This user experience is not good for me. So this company probably just lost a sale because they didn't handle this error on this form. And bad user experience confuses your users. And so this one, they have unconventional navigation on the page. I have a few more issues with this myself, not the least of which is it's actually pretty difficult to even see that nav bar. So the nav bar is actually across the bottom of the screen here. They're not using a lot of contrast in this design. And by that, I mean basically because they have kind of grayscale on those links at the bottom of the page there, they sort of get washed out into the background. And so if we think about where our eyes are drawn to, well, the first thing I see on this screen is obviously the image right in the middle of the page. That's great. It's a beautiful image. Now I have to go back up to the top and I see Zara. Okay, cool. Now I go over to the right-hand side. I see a search bar. I see login. I see help, but I don't know what this site is even for. If I didn't know that Zara was a clothing store, I would have not a clue what's going on here until I scan to the bottom of the page and I see, oh, okay, cool. Well, there's a few different links I can go to, but now I'm even more confused because I don't know which page I'm at currently. I don't know which page I need to go to. It's not really well laid out. So this actually breaks the user's expectations and makes them think too much about how it has to work versus what they want to achieve. So if I came here looking for a pair of shoes, I just spent 30 seconds deconstructing this page until I noticed, oh, there's a link at the bottom of the page here that takes me to the shoes page. The other thing worth mentioning here is not everything runs on a desktop, right? Your resolution is not always going to be a 16:9 aspect ratio, 1920 by 1080 pixels, right? It's not always the same screen size. So if I'm looking at this on my phone, I don't know how they've actually set this up to scale. I might not even be able to see that nav bar when I go to it on my phone. So there's a lot of questions, right? There's a lot of considerations that go into this. So moving on to our last topic, and I'm going through these pretty quick, but I want to make sure there's lots of time for questions and answers at the end as well. So the last thing we'll talk about today is how can we make it better? So how can we improve our user interfaces? How can we improve our users' experience on our websites, on our applications? And so the keys to good user interface are don't make users think. And this is actually the title of a really great book by Steve Krug. So it's actually called Don't Make Me Think. I'm currently reading through it now, but the book was originally written in like 2000, I think, for the original versions of websites. And he's since added more to it, but it's a great common sense approach to how to structure your user interface, how to structure your user experience, and just how to keep usability in your mind when you're doing these things. The next point is make every click instinctive. So a lot of times you'll hear people say you should only really make users click maybe 2 to 3 times to achieve. I don't know that I believe that because a lot of times there's situations where you need to nest things in menus, and basically the approach I take here is if every click is instinctive, if I don't have to think about that interaction, then it probably doesn't count for too much. So you can use that a little bit sparingly, but ideally you want to keep things as easy to navigate as possible. And the last point I'll make here is less is more. So when it comes to visual elements on a screen, basically think of it like prime real estate. The more you put there, the more devalued everything becomes. If your attention is split between multiple things on the screen, or if you're provided more visual information that makes you think more about what it means or why it's there, oftentimes it ruins the experience of everything else on the screen. So if we keep it very streamlined, very minimalist, it actually makes it a much better experience for users, generally speaking. And the 5 components that I have over on the left-hand side here, so there's usability, which is basically how users are meant to interact with this, how users will actually use your product. Information architecture, so it's very rare that anything we design is going to be a very flat data structure. Oftentimes there's a lot of nesting going on. So we need to be very cognizant of that so that we know how to actually display things and when to display things to users. Interaction design is focused on how people actually interact with it. And so if usability is how the product appears and how users expect to see it, interaction design is how the product actually behaves, how people actually interact and achieve things within them. Wireframing would be basically the mock-up that I mentioned earlier. So we can just draw little boxes on a piece of paper to show how everything's delineated within a website, to show where everything sort of lives on a page. And that helps us a huge amount because it lets us test those assumptions right away rather than having to build something first. And then the last component there is visual design. So how do things actually look? And so this relates a lot to the visual hierarchy. So if you're using certain text sizes, making sure everything is set up such that the user's attention is drawn to the right things at the right times. And then the other thing too, it would be contrast. So making sure that you're not using colors that sort of blend in together and get washed out. And one of the big struggles that I had when I was first doing UI UX design was not considering color blindness, not really considering accessibility, which is a huge issue with designs in general, because it's very easy if you don't have to deal with those things yourself to just kind of hand wave them away. But it really does set up users to fail in a big way if they are dealing with those issues. So on to the next slide here, there's a little bit more information. So these are things that I keep in the back of my head whenever I'm designing a new piece of UI. So consistency, basically differences stick out, but similarities become invisible. And as we know, a good UI is one that you're not even aware that you're using. So if we keep things consistent, it sets the user's expectations and it helps them ignore everything that's on the page other than exactly what they want to see. Formatting is key. So colors, sizes, fonts. There's very proven science behind how people will look at certain things, as we saw in that little image before, where you look in the middle of the page first, then down, down, and then up. So by leveraging those things in our formatting, we can actually greatly improve our UI and UX. Context. So that error message that we showed earlier, does the user have the info they need to make a choice? Well, in that case, I didn't, because I didn't know what the actual error condition was. So now I'm left wondering what to do. So we want to make sure as designers, we give our users just enough information that they can make a choice confidently, but not too much information that they start to get confused and bogged down with all the details. Familiarity. So there was a great example of this with our nav bar. So we don't want to try to reinvent the wheel, right? Sometimes it's great. Sometimes reinventing the wheel, you actually come up with something hugely innovative. But a lot of times you just spend a bunch of hours trying to reinvent the wheel with nothing to show for it. And so best practices exist for a reason in this case, right? People expect to interact with things in a certain way now that we're also used to using web interfaces and app interfaces. So if a solution exists off the shelf, then you're probably better off following that. The next point here is clarity. So is it intuitive, intentional, and easily identifiable? So those are some big words, but basically, if I go to a page, do I know what the things mean on that page? And so if we go back to that example of Mun's website, a lot of those little menu sections had great explanations of what they are. However, they're still very high level. And so is it intuitive? I would say to an extent it was. Could it be better? Maybe. But again, as designers, we often have to make those trade-offs. We only have so much real estate to work with, and if everything is vying for our users' intention, it becomes very hard to keep things clear and concise. Then the last point I have here is flexibility. So how do they use it? How will they access it? How can it help them improve? And so again, if we take the measure of a seamless UI to be the best UI, or if we take the measure of a UI that makes people feel empowered to do what they want to do, they can use it effortlessly. How do we make sure that that's the same experience for every user? How do we make sure that's the same experience across every device they might use? It's like I said, not everybody's using a desktop, not everybody's using their phone. You may actually have to design 7 or 8 different user interfaces to be able to facilitate all the different users you might need. Accessibility is a big concern with this flexibility point as well. And then the last point that I'll make on this one is how can it help them improve? So once they learn those aspects of how your user interface works, how can we actually give them options to streamline things? So a great example of this is Microsoft Word. So Control C, Control V, copy, paste, or sorry, for our Mac OS users, Command C, Command V. And so those are now ubiquitous features across the web. Now we know that any website we go to, we should be able to hit those keyboard commands, copy something to our clipboard and paste it somewhere else. And so that's sort of the key indicator that now your users are becoming more advanced, right? They can start to use these keyboard shortcuts. And so we as designers want to continually be improving that so we can continually improve our users' experience within our apps. And the last thing I want to talk about here before we get into the Q&A is some excellent user interface that was out in the wild. And so for anybody that hasn't seen it, this is Airbnb's website. And the first thing I'll mention here is compared to Mun's menu-based interface, because Mun has to account for so many different users with so many different achievements that they're trying to, or different objectives that they're trying to achieve. Airbnb is on the other side of that, right? So they have hosts and they have visitors that want to go on a trip somewhere. So this whole thing becomes very streamlined because they're only handling for a few users. However, I think they've done this very, very well. And so a few things to note on this page. If I'm coming here as a user, I probably want to book a vacation. And that's the first thing that I see on the page. It is front and center in my view, but it's not taking away from anything. It's not super high contrast. It's not super distracting. It just makes me understand that, okay, if this is what I need to do, here are the menus that I need to fill out. And it's actually given me great placeholders on all these things. So I can actually search for surfing in Los Angeles, which is an activity, not even necessarily just a place. I can tell it when I want to go, and I can tell it how many people are going to be there. Other than that, everything else I could ever possibly want on this page is very easily accessible through the four corners here. So because they've indexed that on a reference, it actually makes it very easy for me to jump up. I can see the Airbnb logo in the top left. I can see a whole bunch of different options up in the top right, and I can see my privacy terms down in the bottom right. And so that actually frees up a ton of real estate on this page, where now they can just display this beautiful image, and it just gets me as a user excited about the next trip that I want to take. So diving a little bit deeper into this, we can see now that our friend Edward, it looks like, has logged into his Airbnb account. This is what he's greeted with. And so we still have our search bar up in the top. We still have a very consistent menu layout in the top right. Even that messages icon is great because it looks like I have a pending message up there, but there's not something popping up in the bottom of my screen taking away from it. That message is accessible on my terms, not on the website's terms, which is huge when it comes to user experience. There's also some smart suggestions on the page here, and I really like the way that they've kept a whole lot of color on this page without doing way too much contrast. So there's some really beautiful images sprinkled throughout here, but none of it is really pulling too much of my attention away. A lot of it is very muted, and it works really well with their minimalist design here. And then on this last page, so again, they've done a great job with the gallery. So now they're letting the images be the front and center. So this is what I, as a user, probably want to see. At this point, I've selected somewhere in Amsterdam. And so I want to see what that room actually looks like. So that's my primary goal right now, is learning more about what the space looks like and feels like. Other than that, I still have all of my relevant details across the bottom. So I can see that this room is good for 2 guests. It has 1 bedroom, 2 beds, 1.5 shared baths. I can see the costing. I can see the reviews. All that stuff is readily accessible for me. And I've even got a nice little form down there that's showing me the check-in and check-out dates to pre-select them. And then again, the consistency across this is fantastic. It's all very muted, but at the same time, I know as a user, if I need to bail out of this, I can probably hit that pink icon up in the top left and jump back to the home page. I can jump to a new search. I can go to the hosting page. Like, all those things are readily accessible, but not pulling my attention away from my main goals. So I feel very in control with this UI. And so with those things said, if the user interface is the saddle, the stirrups, and the reins, the user experience is the feeling you get being able to ride the horse. So great user experience, great user interface makes you feel empowered as a user. It makes you feel in control. And that's really what we as designers want to strive for. And that's it. So I'll leave it there. I'm not really sure how you want to handle this now, Kyle. I can stop presenting, but my email address is there for anybody who wants it. I can throw it in the comments as well. But let's have a chat. Let's hear what questions we have.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Clark. So just a reminder for the folks in the audience, because of WebEx's interface, we can either have you put your questions right in the chat box and we can kind of moderate them to Clark, or you can say, I want to ask my question, and then I can go into the attendees list and I can promote you to a panelist. So you can kind of pop up on the screen and have more of a discussion type of interaction. So while the folks in the audience kind of mull about their questions, I'll kick one off just to kind of get things rolling and maybe get the juices flowing in people's minds. Oh, actually, we have a question right in the chat box already from Rachel. How do you validate the quality of a UI you're developing or have developed?
That's a great question, Rachel. Thank you. I would say the best way to do it is to put it in front of a user. So as a full stack developer, I often spend a lot of time straddling the line between putting designs in place and actually building them into software. And oftentimes that can lead to a situation where you're way too close to things. I know how things are built. I know how things are supposed to work. So I can become totally blind to very, very easy to miss usability bugs. So the best way to test and validate those things is to put it in front of the user that you designed it for and just let them break it and see how best to fix it from there.
Fantastic. Does that answer your question, Rachel? Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. Yasser in the chat would love to join in on the conversation, so I'm just going to pull him in as a panelist.
Yeah,
So
perfect.
Yasser, you should be hopping in here with the option to turn on your camera and your microphone. So you mute by default. That's so you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi. I would like first, I would test my settings first. Yeah. Hi. Do you see me? Thanks.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, actually, I would love first to introduce myself. My name is Yasa. I'm an exchange student from Denmark at Memorial University. I would love to thank Caleb for having this event, and I would love to join you in person soon. Actually, I would love to share with you these details that about UX and UI. As you explained, you give two contrasting examples, very useful one that where the user expects things and what does the user see and what doesn't see. And actually, I would love also to add the difference between UX and UI. The difference between them is they are in the same domain, but they are different. The UX is what the user experience, and the UI what the user see. With the user interface, the user see the icons, the environment that he's going to navigate through. But the user experience what he experienced through navigating through this structure or the website. So in this case, they are interrelated to each other, but different fields, where you focus on the design and also you focus on the experience. From my experience in different fields, for example, in robots or in the website or the mobile apps, is totally different, where we have to address different aspects with different issues. So in each case, we have to set our goals, to set our things that we need to achieve. So having this structure in mind would make things easier for developers, either in the design or in the software. So in this case, combining all these experience, and that's why the communication skills is very important in this case. So as you said, Carl, in your case, you are a full stack developer, so cooperating and help in doing things in the back end and the front end and the user and the UX, it's make things, as you said, sometimes because you are involved in the process, you don't see the things that you should take in for granted. You know it's there, but you know when you are involved, sometimes you miss it. But that's why this is also a process, a continuous process with the users or with the audience or with the apps users. For example, this process is going to come in, it goes in a process just like one step ahead, two steps back. So you present things, you take the feedback, you go back two steps to understand what's going on and these stuff. So it's an evolving process until you reach a goal that is the satisfaction of the agent or of the users or of the client. So in this case, it's just like multi and complicated process for UX and UI and developing. So it sounds easy, but when you get involved, it's not easy because things you have to take care of technical issues, you have to take care of design issues, and you have to take care of all these UI and UX experience. That's what I would love to share with you, and I really appreciate the time you gave to me.
Thank you so much for the, well, first of all, the clarifications and for sharing those things. That was very, very well said, Yasser. And I couldn't agree more. That's, as you mentioned, when you start blending all of these different things together and you're doing even, not even just like web design, with robotics, with HMIs, all those things. Yeah, having those user requirements and iterating on them to achieve a very polished final product. It's a very difficult process, but it can be extremely rewarding as a UI designer to see those things actually brought to life and to see the users that you're building them for actually succeed with that user interface. So thank you very much for sharing.
Fantastic. Thank you,
My
Yasser.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and I would love to give the space or the floor for anyone who would love to share his experience or her experience.
Excellent. We do have a question in the chat from Catherine. Catherine asks, how do you balance outside feedback versus what you feel is the best design for a UI UX? Clark?
That's a really good question. Thank you for that, Catherine. And it's a difficult one because it kind of goes back to the whole concept of don't reinvent the wheel, right? And that's as a fairly new user interface, user experience designer, it's very easy to fall into the trap of just grabbing pieces off the shelf and using them, right? Because it does make things a lot easier. And oftentimes that is a good solution. However, there are a lot of situations where users probably do need something novel. They probably do need something that's custom for them. And so, as always, it's a really difficult balance and prioritization to make as a designer, as a developer, to find these things that work for your users. And sometimes listening to them is the right way. Sometimes listening to them is not the right way. And it's like a lot of different things, right? I'm sure Kyle can relate to this as well, coming from a human factors background. A lot of times people ask for things, and oftentimes they're trying to solve a problem and they don't even realize it. They've come to a conclusion in their head that this is what I need to satisfy the problem that I think that I'm having, when in reality, having somebody help them identify the root cause of the problem and address that directly may actually be the better way to go forward. So it's a really long-winded way to answer a very good question, but I hope that's brought some clarity to you, Catherine. Does that answer the question?
Awesome. Thanks, Catherine. And just to build on that a little bit, that's actually something that you struggle with in any industry that you work in.
Definitely.
My experience working in industrial maintenance, we used to follow continuous improvement all the time to try and figure out not what was the surface issue, but what is the root cause of the problem. So sometimes a great tool to use with clients or customers is a 5 why analysis, and just continue to ask. And it might feel like you're, talking to a 4-year-old, but if you go why enough times in a row, why is that a problem? Why is that a problem? You might eventually drill down to the root cause. And sometimes people don't realize that there is something beneath the surface that needs to be resolved. So I love that line of questioning, and thank you for your question, Catherine.
Actually, I would love to add something regarding Catherine's question. Actually, how do you balance this feedback? It actually is an experimental field. That's why you have to involve the users or the target audience in the process. In this case, when they suggest something and it should be in that way, so they should be involved, and then you put it in the table, so they test it, they try it, they get the feedback, and then you give them into A/B design and or A/B something that they need to experience. For example, A, that what they target for, B, what you think is maybe it's good, better, and the better things that you be done. So in this case, we give an experiment the field. It's like you give it, you involve them in the process, you give them the experience, and then you tell them, how do you feel? How do you think? This is you give the feedback, and unconsciously here what you deliver the message to the audience or to the people who thinks that it should be in that way. So in this case, you put them in the process, you show them the result, you present the data, and how things should be done. And in this case, you build your field or approach into academic or empirical scientific things by involving data. So in this case, for example, if we got some audiences. For example, in this experience, we bring five people and give them a design, and then B design for other 5 people, and then we give the feedback, take the feedback from both, and then we switch the samples, and then we give the feedback from each participant, and then we present the data. So in this case, you can take this feedback into more empirical and the scientific field by presenting data and the psychological field and the technical field. So in this case, when you build this process, you build it in more convincing and scientific and empirical aspects. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, very well said. Usability testing is a huge field all on its own, and it's very much still evolving, still blossoming. And that's actually that book that I mentioned earlier, Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug, goes into, I think there's a full chapter on how to do usability testing on a budget, because a lot of times usability testing can be super expensive, getting together your target demographics and everything else. So yeah, being able to do those things very quickly and effectively and bringing it right back to the root cause of the problem, but letting people see the solution to it. Oftentimes people don't know what they need until they can see it in front of them. So yeah, thank you again, Yasser, for sharing.
Absolutely. We had a comment from Lisa in the chat, and she's a current student of Get Coding, and she just wanted to express that it's been very informative, and she appreciates that you've been sharing your knowledge. So thank you, Lisa, for your comment there. If you had any questions, feel free to please hop into the chat. We're happy to answer your questions. And I'm going to take a step back and ask maybe a question that might come from a student perspective. For someone who's never done it before, Clark, what do you do to help you optimize the user's critical path when you're building a user interface?
That's a really good question. And that's, yeah, it's something that I went a little bit lighter on in the presentation, not just because it's a very technical thing, but also because I'm still learning a lot of these things myself. I'm by no means an expert on any of this. What I do is stick to the requirements. And so I think you said it really well, Kyle, the 5 whys. Why do you want to do that? Why do you want to do that in this way? Why is it important that it happens in this way? And then by kind of distilling down into those core requirements, it becomes very easy then to build on top of it. And so by understanding and empathizing with your users, it actually becomes quite a lot easier. So that's there's a foundation called the Interaction Design Foundation that I was able to sit in on one of the talks that one of their, I think her name is Tiziana, she put off, but it is amazing to me how much empathetic design is what's growing now, but it's also like that, adding the layer of psychology into it vastly improves your user outcomes. And so to speak to the question very directly, user requirements, 100% technical requirements. Yasser mentioned this as well. Drilling those down and having a very concrete set of what you need to accomplish, and then building on it from there through usability testing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that answer, Clark.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
And I'd like to build on the whole concept behind human factors, because as you know, an engineer, you don't, and that's my background. You don't always get exposed to that as an undergraduate student. It's something that I never even had, an inkling about until I reached graduate studies. And there's a whole study and field of knowledge behind cognitive load and how people perceive processes. And I can't remember which textbook it was in, or maybe it was in one of the books we read for a course we did on human factors. But there was a study that folks had done, and it actually measured how well people responded to things by adding more and more things to their cognitive load. So the more things that were kind of happening in their field of view, or the more things that they were interacting with, their accuracy maintained up until there were 2 or 3 things vying for their attention. And as soon as you add that 4th element, their capacity to respond to those different elements dropped off significantly. So just being aware of, what is an individual's capacity to respond to stimulus can be really important, and how you design something. And it's really nice to see that this is coming to the forefront, being a discussion point, and being a field of study, because uh, again, coming from an industrial background, and anybody's in the audience has ever dealt with SAP, they know that user experience can really be hampered by interfaces that are not so nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's in my previous career as a maintenance technician in the oil and gas industry, a lot of those things still ring very true, right? I mean, the the people that I was fixing equipment for were interacting with user interfaces constantly, right? And several layers of engineering was done to make those things as simple as possible. But a lot of times those were people that had never actually seen the machines or seen how the users interacted with the machines at the end of the day. And so, yeah, most times when I was fixing things on site, it was because the users didn't know that they were supposed to do things a certain way. So, yeah, it's having those technical requirements and usability testing. And yeah, like you say, it's so relevant the whole way through, and empathizing with your users.
Absolutely. I'll just say a reminder to the folks out there in the chat: if you have any questions for Clark, please feel free to put them in the chat, or say I wanna say my piece. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, definitely. And
No, so go ahead, Clark.
sorry, I was just gonna say I apologize, Lisa. I missed giving you a shout out, but thank you very much for attending, and thank you for the compliments as well. And for anybody else that's here that doesn't feel comfortable coming forward in the presentation here, my email is clark@polyunity.com. It was up in the presentation there. Um, Feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Always happy to talk about this stuff, and always happy to help out any way I can.
Fabulous. We have a question from Jacqueline in the chat. Her question is, how useful are errors to improving UI UX?
That's a really good question, and there's a few layers to it. I just want to ask a clarifying question. So, do you mean errors like if I'm doing usability testing and my user finds an error, or if I'm building a piece of UI and I want to preemptively fix those errors so users don't have to deal with them? Or is it a combination of the two?
Validation errors.
Validation errors. Yeah. So, ideally, the best thing you can do is actually set up the UI such that you're handling the errors up front. So instead of having your user go through that whole form, put in all their details, hit submit, and then find out, oh, there was an error in one of my fields, you really want to handle that as close to where the validation error occurs. And so if I'm putting in my credit card details and I enter an invalid number, as soon as I leave that field, that error message should pop up and say, sorry, this is not a valid credit card number. As a user, I sorry, as the designer, I don't want my user's attention to be flowing back and forth throughout that whole process, right? Because as Kyle mentioned with human factors, the more things you're kind of keeping in your mind at the same time, the less your accuracy becomes. And so handling those errors and letting them move on from them is really critical, I think, to having a good interface design. And so, yeah, I will also mention too that as a designer and developer at the same time, uh, oftentimes you're designing things that aren't going to be ideal, right? So you're oftentimes making those trade-offs. And so unfortunately, I think for a lot of people, you end up not handling errors as well as you probably could in the interest of prioritizing something else in the UI. And so uh, as Yasser mentioned as well, it's a very iterative process, right? So in terms of how important are errors, critically important. Giving users the information they need to succeed through their critical path is like 100% the name of the game. And then helping them kind of fail safely within it as well. So yeah, very, very important.
Fantastic. I have another question here from Josip. And forgive me if I'm pronouncing anyone's names wrong. But how would you optimize for mobile UI and not just a static computer browser?
That's a really good question. And I think well, I don't think I know that I struggled with that a lot when I first started designing things for web. So if you're familiar with any user interface design tools, so like Figma or Adobe XD, a lot of times they'll actually allow you to start off with a certain wireframe size or a certain frame size. And so the best way I've found for creating responsive designs is to start with mobile first. So you start with the smallest screen you're ever anticipating your users to use first, and then it becomes very easy to build things up from there. It's easier to add in white space and additional, like if you have multiple sections side by side, it's very easy to modify those things with a grid layout. Whereas if you design for desktop first, you have a huge amount of real estate, and the first thing that you're probably going to want to do is fill it up with a whole bunch of things. And then it becomes very, very difficult to remove them and still maintain a good user experience and a good flow while you're doing that. And so, yeah, if you're just getting started out, definitely mobile first. And actually, when I was doing Get Coding, that was one of the things that Jan Mertlik, one of the founders, he was one of my instructors for user interface design. And that's what he taught me, was just, I think he calls it frictionless design, which the way he describes it is basically mobile first, and then everything just scales up from there. So that would be, I think, the best way to do that. But again, still pretty new to all this, so take it with a grain of salt.
Perfect. Thanks, Clark. Does that answer your question, Josep?
Is it not me who asked the question? Is there another Yasa?
Sorry?
It was not me who asked the question. Is there another Yasa?
Josip, Josip. All right, folks. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time, and I know that Clark has a hard stop for an appointment at 2. Is there any other questions out there in the audience before we glue up?
Yeah, I'd love to hear any other questions anybody has. And unfortunately,
sorry, Clark. Actually, I would love to take these few minutes just to add something regarding the question: how useful are errors for improving UX and UI? Actually, this is very intense one, because without the errors, you will never know what to expect and what to avoid and what not to avoid. So having errors through the process, either in the developing the UI or the UX, are very essential in the process, because the errors are the ways to improve things later. So this is the way how to make things better. This is the first thing. And the other question regarding the responsive layout, actually, now when we talk about UX or UI, they are totally different, because if you are a developer, now you have through the CSS3 language that you can develop the responsive layout no matter what the screen size or the device that you are working on. For example, if you use certain codes to improve the code of the code improving and cleaning the code to make things, targeting certain things, that then your design will fit into any screen, regardless the screen measure that you use, either it's no matter what. So this is the first thing. So there are new technology now that you can check to improve the responsivity of the design. And regarding building the UX, regarding the UI, now we have an auto layout for the building the component. So when you are building the component through Figma, then you have the auto layout feature that make each component can fit into the screen, no matter what's the size of the screen. So in this case, you save yourself so much time and so much effort to make the design responsive and fit into any screen. So keeping or catching up with the new technology makes you catch up with the requirements of the work and make things easier for you. And so in simple words, keep an eye on that new technology to catch up with the requirement of the market. So in this case, for example, using the auto layout for the elements or the component that you are creating through Figma will save you so much time and effort in dealing with so many screen size at the same time. So in my approach, I usually use one layout that could fix and fit into different screens. So in this case, through the process of the design, I put in mind how it should look in that screen size, how it should look in that device. So in this case, I'm making the process shorter and very precise at the same time. So in this case, where I have accuracy, you will have the accuracy and you will have the responsibility at the same time. So keeping up and catching up with the new technology always is the key. Thank you.
Yeah, very, very well said. And yeah, it's been actually quite a long time since I've done any designs in Figma. I mostly work in a single application now that we're building with PolyUnity. So it's not often like we're doing, it's a desktop only application. So it's been quite a while since I've looked at responsiveness and stuff. So it's very, very nice to have your experience and your perspective on this as well, Yasser. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, folks, that's just about time. So thank you all so much for attending. And I'd like to thank Clark so much for taking time out of his day to do this presentation. It was really informative, and I think we had some great discussion from the folks who were in the attendees lounge. If you want to learn more about Clark, you can reach out to him by email. And Clark, would you mind just repeating your email again?
Yeah, for sure. So it's clark@polyunity.com. So CLARK at PolyUnity, PolyUnity.com. And you can reach me on LinkedIn as well. It's Clark Oake, CLARK OAKE. So feel free, reach out with any questions, any comments, any clarifications, anything at all. Happy to connect. Happy to share my knowledge, what little of it I have.